Well, Biden got it wrong again. Welcome to another installment of the Connecticut Gun Bench. Today's video is brought to you by P.A.N. Firearms LLC. P.A.N. Firearms for your NRA certification and multifaceted gun training. You can contact us at 203-300-6343 or use our website, www.panfirearmsllc.com. As always, there'll be a link in the description box below. But let's talk about this. Joe Biden, in his speech on April 8th, 2021, made some questionable, if not outrageous, statements.
But what is actually a public health crisis. Nothing I'm about to recommend in any way impinges on the Second Amendment. They're phony arguments suggesting that these are Second Amendment rights at stake from what we're talking about. But no amendment to the Constitution is absolute. You can't yell fire in a crowded movie theater. We call it freedom of speech. From the very beginning, you couldn't own any weapon you wanted to own. From the very beginning the Second Amendment existed, certain people weren't allowed to have weapons. So the idea is just bizarre to suggest that some of the things we're recommending are contrary to the Constitution. And I might add, the Second Amendment from the day it was passed limited the type of people who could own a gun and what type of weapon you could own. You couldn't buy a cannon.
In another interview, Biden made this audacious claim.
You couldn't buy a cannon. Those who say the blood of patriots, and all the stuff about how we're going to have to move against the government. Well, the tree of liberty is not water with the blood of patriots. What's happened is that there never been, if you want to think you need to have weapons to take on the government, you need F-15s and maybe some nuclear weapons.
Most interestingly, where he says no amendment to the Constitution is absolute. You can't yell fire in a crowded movie theater. Recall from his freedom of speech. From the very beginning, you couldn't own any weapon you wanted. From the very beginning that the Second Amendment existed, certain people weren't allowed to have weapons. Now, if we were to take him literally that no amendment to the Constitution is absolute, that would mean the amendments freeing the slaves, women's rights to vote, freedom of speech, according to him, can be summarily ignored or changed at the whim of those with an alternate view who happen to be in authority. But to that point, a majority of what he said is absolutely false. But one part of his statement is actually true. Certain persons were not allowed to own firearms. In the latter part of the 17th century, fear of slave uprisings created gun laws across the South, specifically stating that Negroes, slaves, could not be in possession of firearms, knives, or edged objects that could cause injury or death. Around that same time, Virginia, passed an act for preventing Negro insurrection. These laws were considered constitutional due to the lack of citizenship among the black populace at that time, which conveniently sidesteps the wording right of the people in the verbiage of the Second Amendment. From the George Mason University Civil Rights Law Journal, Volume 2, Gun Control and Racism, authored by Stefan B. Tahmassebi. The first gun control laws were enacted in the antebellum South, forbidding blacks, whether free or slave, to possess arms in order to maintain blacks in their servile status. After the Civil War, the South continued to pass restrictive firearms laws in order to deprive the newly freed blacks from exercising their rights of citizenship. During the later part of the 19th century and early part of the 20th century, gun control laws were passed in the South in order to disarm agrarian reformers and in the North to disarm union organizers. In the North, as strong xenophobic reactions to recent waves of immigrants added further fuel for gun control laws, which were used to disarm such persons. Other firearms ownership restrictions were adopted in order to repress the incipient black civil rights movement. With the ending of the Civil War and freeing of black slaves, black code legislation, which forbade free blacks from owning firearms, was still being enacted throughout the South. Specifically, Mississippi's Black Code Law contained a provision that stated, quote, "Be it enacted that no freedman, free, Negro, or mulatto, not in the military and not licensed to do so by the Board of Police, of his or her county shall keep or carry firearms of any kind or any ammunition, and all such arms or ammunition shall be forfeited to the informer. It is alleged that the confiscated firearms would then turn over to either the Klan, local law enforcement, which back then in most cases was one and the same, or local militia, which blacks were not allowed to be a part of. These black code laws were in effect until Congress overrode them with the passage of the 1866 Civil Rights Act. Yes, throughout the time period from the 1600s to 1866, laws were enacted to prevent blacks, Native Americans, and newly arriving immigrants from owning firearms. Even after the passage of the 14th Amendment, Southern states would try to circumvent it by banning inexpensive firearms, which is all that most Southern blacks could afford. So in conclusion, Joe Biden is correct. Certain people were disqualified from owning firearms, and that disqualification was not based on the overall safety of society, but based solely on race. Now, the notion, his second part of his statement, that one could not own any weapon is a complete falsehood and spoken for the purposes of propaganda, and a statement that is in conflict with actual history. During the 2019 election campaign, he stated that you could not own a cannon during the Revolutionary War. The existence of the privateers and their part in the country's history clearly shows this to be a false statement. There is the book titled A History of American Privateers by Edgar Stanton, published in 1899, where the author discussed the exploits of private citizens who owned ships with cannons, and they were used as a form of, for all intentional purposes, legal piracy. They were commissioned to capture ships of nations that were considered enemies of the U.S. and they could keep any plunder that they could get from the captured vessel. They were implemented during the French Indian War, Civil and Revolutionary War. Many sailors in service of privateers would go on to serve in the U.S. Navy. Politifact, as a matter of consideration, actually took up that argument, and historians immediately said that they were doubtful there were any laws to bar individual ownership of cannons during the Revolutionary War period, because in order to prove a statement of fact, you have to provide law. The Biden campaign did not provide any law, and as a matter of fact, they ignored Politifact's, when they asked them, for a statement on what they had found. The Biden campaign chose to decline. You go down to Dave Koppel, who's the research director and Second Amendment project director at the Free Market Independence Institute. He said, "I am not aware of any ban on any arm in colonial America," he said. "There were controls on people or locations, but not bans on arms types or type of arms." And then we come down to, and let's see if I can find it here. Here we go. And Julie Ann Sweet, a historian and director of military studies at Baylor University, said, "It seems very unlikely, highly unlikely," is her actual wording, "that there were restrictions on the private ownership of cannons. Americans at that time could procure any weapons that they could afford." This leads to the bigger question. Biden was obviously pandering to the specific audience, an audience that was not interested in facts, that are willing to accept historical falsehoods because it applied to their agenda. There's always the argument that weapons that shoot multiple rounds were not included in the framework or ideal of the Second Amendment, but then they completely ignore the fact that the Gatling gun, the Cookson repeater, the Garandini air rifle were produced and sold to anyone who could afford them. To summarize, Biden's statement is partially correct. Some people were not allowed to own firearms. That was based solely on racism. Also, as of the formation of the constitutions, that persons were limited on what kind of firearms they could own is completely false, based on the lack of actual documentation, a law stating so, that one could then refer to and say, well, you weren't allowed to own this. There were no such laws written. And also physical evidence through documented history. I'm going to leave all relevant information in the links below, as I always do, so you can look into this yourself for your own independent review. But let me know what you think. Please leave your comments in the comment section below. As always, any comments of violence or calls for violence will be removed. Please like, share, and subscribe. Make sure you hit that notification bell to get notified when the next video goes live. And I'll see you on the next one. Peace.